She made it. She left Houston this morning in a biblical thunderstorm. They were on the tarmac. They were able to lift off. She arrived in plenty of time with not even her eyebrow lifted or messed up, right? So we're so happy to have you. Intrepid traveler and world citizen. And my friend, Joanne, thank you for being here. I think of Joanne as a triple threat Renaissance writer. She is a novelist, a short story expert, yes, and also a journalist, which is how she began as a journalist for the Christian Science Monitor. Her works of fiction include the just published now, Far Side of the Desert, which we're celebrating this week on her book tour, and which was selected as one of the top 10 books recommended by the Christian Science Monitor for the month of March nationwide. Before The Far Side of the Desert, her first thriller was published last year, 2023. You keep them flowing, don't you, Joanne?
I'm overnight in 30 years.
Okay. As so many of us in different ways, yes? And that book actually was published just about a year ago, Burning Distance, which I can highly recommend. And also before that, The Dark Path to the River and No Marble Angels. Joanne is a vice president of PEN International, and she serves on the board of the International Center for Journalists and the Writers Museum, which is particularly significant for Sisters in Crime because a few months ago, she and our, shall we say, our mother and master writer, Sarah Pretsky, was in dialogue with Joanne at the American Writers Museum in Chicago. In addition to those boards, she is also on Words Without Borders, Refugees International, and is an emeritus director of Poets and Writers, the PEN Faulkner Foundation, and Human Rights Watch. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and also an organization you just heard about, the Texas Institute of Letters, where last night at the awards banquet, she happened to sit next to Terry Shames. So that is the synchronicity and the serendipity and the wonder of the universe. We sisters reach out and are connected with one another. And also, did I mention in her spare time, she writes? Yeah. Thank you for being an inspiration to us all and for making it to LA.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I lived in Los Angeles for 11 years, so it's always a bit of a homecoming coming back here. And I was president of the PEN USA Center, West Center, the year of the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, Tiananmen Square. It dates me, but there I am. And that's how I met Georgia, is through PEN out here. And it was interesting last night, if you do believe, and I think most writers deep down do believe in a kind of harmony in the universe. That's why we write. We try to figure out what it is and make a story that makes sense so that the dots all connect. Georgia had mentioned that Terry was at the Texas Institute of Letters. We're down in Houston. And I walk into the banquet room, which is big, and there's probably 200 people. And I think, I don't know who she is. I don't know what she looks like. I don't know many of these people. And I go to a table and I ask a woman if I can, if this seat is taken. She said, no, sit here. And it's Terry's sister. So, and with a blank chair right next to her where Terry comes and sits. So there is some harmony or synchronicity, I think, in the universe. It was very reaffirming. But at 5:20 this morning, I got in a car to go to the airport for a 6:40 flight, which didn't take off till 4 hours later because there were thunderstorms. So I wasn't sure I was going to get here on time, but I did. So the universe connects, so I'm very happy about that. I have been writing and having the privilege of having books come out, but I have been writing for 30 years in fiction. And when a book wouldn't get published, I would start the next book. And in the process of writing the next book, I would become a better novelist, and then I would go back to the first book. And then that one didn't get published, and so I'd write another novel, then become better and go back to the next two. So that's my publishing career. So now I look very, very prolific, but I'm just prolific in a period of about 30 years. But that's all right too, because the books that are coming out now are, I will say, much better than they would have been. But had they come out when I first wrote them, they would have been fairly prescient, because the novel Burning Distance, it's been marketed as Romeo and Juliet with a backstory of arms trafficking in the Middle East. So, or John le Carré meets Jane Austen. But it really, it looks at the proliferation and the trafficking and the selling of the components of the weapons of mass destruction, a lot of which were sold to Saddam Hussein through the West, through Europe, some through the United States. And the journalist in me became very interested in that and did lots and lots of research. And this was before the internet was as wide as it is now. So I have notebooks and notebooks of literal news clippings, you know, from that period. And so it would have been fairly prescient had it come out, but it didn't, and now it's just historical fiction. So, and fortunately, the publisher, Oceanview Publishing, saw the thriller nature of the books I was writing, because I wasn't setting out to write political thrillers. I was just setting out to write the novel that, you know, evolved through my characters and what I was writing. So the sort of more traditional publisher said, she's a very good writer, but what is this? Is it a thriller? Is it a love story? Is it a family story? Is it a mystery? And so when somebody said, we're publishing it as a political thriller, I said, great, I'm now an international political thriller writer. So now I better start reading them, because I have not read that many. Of course, I've read, you know, John le Carré and Graham Greene and others. So I'm beginning to enjoy this genre and go to places like Bauscher Khan and Thriller Fest, none of which I had known about, but the publisher sort of oriented me, you know, into that universe, and Sisters in Crime. And it was nice to meet Sarah Paretsky, and I actually were on a panel, and not a panel, the two of us are in dialogue at the American Writers Museum in Chicago, but we were talking about censorship in banned books, and she was taking the domestic side and I was taking the international side. Because when I was out here in Los Angeles, I had moved from New York, I will say fairly reluctantly, because, you know, New York, I had my writing group and I taught at NYU and all, but my husband got a good position out here. And I began to meet the writers out here, almost all of which had some connection to Hollywood. So that was interesting. But after about 3 years, my heart turned, and I love being in Los Angeles, and I love the writers I was meeting. And it was out here that I first got involved with Penn. I went to a dinner just to meet writers. And then I was invited to somebody's home, and we were writing postcards on behalf of a writer in prison who was imprisoned in China. And I had grown up in the South, and, you know, I had been very active sort of in civil rights and women's rights back in the 60s when most of my friends were not. So I left Texas. But I had that instinct, and I became very interested in Penn and began working in it. And I don't know if any of you here would remember the name Digby Deal. Yes? Well, Digby was, as you know, was the book editor to the Los Angeles Times, and Digby and I became friends and would go to these Penn congresses together. And if you know Digby, he was really a bon vivant. I mean, he would go and research the best restaurants, the best things to see, and I would research all the writers in prison work together. So we were a pretty good team, you know. And you know, we would commit that way. And so Digby asked me, and the board asked me to accept the presidency the year of 88, 89, I think it was. And it was a big year. We doubled our membership. Carolyn C. was the program director. I became good friends with Carolyn and just met wonderful, wonderful writers out here. And it was, but from this podium, just when we thought, oh, I'm settled, I really love Los Angeles. Well, as life will do it, it will take you up and say, that's good, now let me show you your next adventure. So we moved from Los Angeles to London, England, and by then I had two sons. They were 8 and 10, and Penn International is headquartered in London. And I had gotten to know the individuals there through the congresses that we had at the time, twice a year. And I was asked to chair what's called the Writers in Prison Committee. Now that's the work that Penn does for writers around the world in countries where the governments somehow think writers have power, and they put them in prison or they even kill them. And so Penn has 150 centers in over 100 countries around the world. Now, American Penn, which is now merged or subsumed Penn West out here, so there's only one Penn Center, is the largest by far of these centers. But there's Penn Centers, there are 2 in Canada, it was founded in England, all over the world. So I had the great privilege of working on behalf of writers around the world who were in prison, and getting to know writers around the world. And it was just a wonderful experience. And then down the road, and I won't go through all the backstory, I was asked to stand for the position that was called the International Secretary. And at the time, Penn had no paid executive. So it had administrative staff, and then it had a board. So it's probably, you know what that's like. You don't have a paid executive. So I was really, and I had the president was a Czech writer who was good friends with Václav Havel, but he was not interested in the day-to-day running. So that really fell to me globally. And that was a real privilege, and I got to work. But the first thing I did is hire an executive director. I had the board. We all agreed we needed an executive for an organization like that. So we did hire an executive director. So that's sort of the journey I've had. So while these novels were not getting published, I was still writing daily. I mean, I wrote daily, and I would write the next one, and then I'd write the next one. And I was publishing some journalism and some short stories. But, and then I was working with Penn, and then a few other, nonprofits like Human Rights Watch. I was on that board, and Save the Children, because there were a lot of issues that interested me. And they also, through these organizations, I was able to go into some really interesting places in the world. So I've been able to travel widely in the Middle East as I was writing Burning Distance. I would be in Lebanon with Save the Children or UNHCR or Penn or the International Crisis Group. And the wonderful aspect of living in Europe, if any of you have lived there, is everything is so close. So in an hour plane ride, you can be in 20 countries. I mean, so it was a wonderful exposure. But then in the mid-90s, my oldest son was going to college, and my youngest, who I'll speak about in a minute, we had always said, well, listen to what you want to do. We won't promise, and he said, I want to go back. I'm afraid I'll forget what it is to be an American. Okay, so we moved back. We moved to Washington, D.C. My oldest son went off to college. My youngest son, who was a skateboarder, he was a skateboarder, hair out to here, baggy pants, came back when he was a sophomore in high school. And we lived in Washington. Well, this son, his junior year, I think the spring of his junior year, you start getting these postcards. If you're a high school student, saying you did so well on your PSATs, consider us. And colleges start sending him. He got one, and he said, oh, also my oldest son was off to Harvard. He was a wrestler. He's captain of the wrestling team. My oldest son said, I'm not going to college. I just want to skateboard. And we said, yeah. I said to my husband, let's don't have this argument. We know how smart he is. Let's just he's in a good school, let the environment work on him. So my husband put his hands on my son's shoulders and said, he said to me, yes, let's don't have an argument, but his hands on my son's shoulders and said, you're my son. You will be an educated man. I said, okay. But I have to go to college. I want to go to one that leaves me alone. I can skateboard in the afternoon. So we just didn't have the argument. Well, to fast forward, he gets this postcard from the U.S. Air Force Academy saying, you did so well in your PSATs, consider us. And I started to throw it away. He said, wait, not so fast, Mom. I went, okay. Well, he decides to apply to the academy, military. I said, well, that's great, but they won't leave you alone to skateboard. And these are where the jocks go. They're really physically fit. He was. And my husband took him out that summer between his junior and senior year and said, let's see what you can do. And his brother, meanwhile, is in the Harvard wrestling team. He's very fit and all, and he takes my son to a gym, said, let's see what you can do. So he says, all right, sit-ups, 12. Push-ups, maybe 15. Pull-ups. Elliot, pull-ups. None. And he has tears in his eyes, and my husband says, okay, you've watched your brother. If you really want this, we'll get you on a regime. He starts working out twice a day that summer. He drops 35 pounds. He goes out for the cross-country team, wins all county, wins the coaches award, goes out for lacrosse, wins the Coach's Award, gets into the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy and 3 other universities. And at that stage, to my great relief, decides to go to Tufts because I think here's a kid who's been, a skateboarder and he's going to go into the academy. But he, Tufts, Harvard, MIT had a ROTC unit. He was the head of it. My husband said to me, don't worry, he'll get great leadership training. We're at peace. There's nothing to worry about. Well, his senior year, 9/11 happens. Okay. So anyway, I'm fast forwarding this. This does connect a bit because just to show you the journey that we all take and we can't see where it's going. So he does deploy. He serves 8 years in the Marines. He wins a Silver Star, Bronze Star for Valor. He's 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's in the worst of the worst. But he comes back after it, and he's a White House fellow for a year. But after it, he, unbeknownst to us, starts writing as soon as he knows he's out, and he starts writing. And he finally shows me his work and said, do you think I should get an MFA? And I said, I do this, and I teach this. And I know I'm your mother, but you are really good. You need an agent and a publisher. Well, he's been publishing with Knopf and Random House ever since Book a Year, and was a finalist for the National Book Award. So you never know the journey that children are taking or that you're taking, because I think one bit of advice I think was good for me. I don't know if he remembers it. I said, I don't know if you'll be successful. I think you're very good. I don't know how successful. Even if you're highly successful and touted and winning awards, it will not fill you up. If you love to write, then do it. He said, I love to write. I said, well, then do it. But I can assure you, even if you're highly, it will not fill you. It just doesn't, all of that doesn't last. It's the writing that has to guide you. And I think as writers, when we learn that, we get a monkey off of our shoulder. And we just start loving our work. So, when I talk to students, I say, love your talent, but don't demand everything of it for yourself. Love it, give it the time. And people often ask me, well, how can I write? I said, well, are you writing every day? You have to learn to get the ideas here onto paper, however you do that. A basketball player doesn't learn by reading books on basketball. You have to be out there, you have to be doing it. And you may or may not be publishing right away. But if you're writing and if you're loving it and if you're getting better, there are channels that open and there's a serendipity. Anyway, I thought what might be helpful is if I read, because only I think George has read my book. So if I just read a little bit from each novel that just came out, maybe that would be helpful, and then I can answer questions. This novel, Burning Distance, is the one that is John le Carré meets Jane Austen. So I'll just read the opening of that. And as many of you know, because there's so many writers in this room, you don't always know, you think you know where the book might be going, but the characters tend to come alive and they say, I'm not going over there, I'm going over here. I'm not. So that's interesting. The process is so interesting for that reason. This is the prologue, the daughter of Jesse West. Umbrellas snap open like a flock of blackbirds arriving at the grave. 12 of us stand wing to wing as clouds roll over the green hills and the rain falls harder. Few families endure one murder. I am mourning the second in my lifetime. I'm 19 years old, and I am beginning to see that life connects. My father used to say, there are no coincidences, only life showing you its patterns. As I watch our small gathering on the hillside, I strain to see the pattern. My mother stands slightly apart from the rest of us in her old navy coat, her thick-heeled boots, her unruly blonde hair curling wildly in the rain. I wonder if she saw the pattern, or if my father figured it out before he was killed 9 years ago. His funeral was the first I attended. Early this morning, as we gathered on the steps of our home in London, I caught sight of a small man in a black cap and black raincoat watching our house. He stood under a chestnut tree like an exclamation point at the end of the row of white houses. I recognized him. Standing now at the graveside, I still feel his menace. His narrow eyes honed onto mine like a cobra sizing up its prey. Then he slipped away. To calm my thoughts, protect myself, I think of my father's other observation. A prodigal prophet with a crew cut. He used to quote from Proverbs. I repeat his words as a prayer. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. So that's the opening. Now, the journey in writing that book, as I have mentioned, was long, and it took many turns, and it didn't always open there. It opened because it deals with issues like weapons and nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. I thought, so why am I writing that? But I was just compelled to keep researching it. And I thought, well, the way to make this novel work is to get a narrative voice that people will buy into. Because as you know, once you believe the narrative voice telling the story, you'll go anywhere with it. You'll believe the story if the voice is honest. So the novel originally opened, and the next chapter opens with a young 10-year-old girl who runs into the house. The phone is ringing, nobody's at home, and she answers, and the man on the phone asks for her father, and he's not there, and her mother's not there, and he says, tell your mother to tell your father they've sanded his gas tank. That's all the message. She doesn't know what that means. She tells her mother, who does know what that means. And that night, a phone call comes in at 4 a.m, and her father's plane has crashed into the Persian Gulf. So she's 10. Her two older sisters are 13 and 16, and the mother is a newspaper, a magazine editor, and she moves the whole family to London. So the story of Lizzie is at the American school in London, where there are children from all different backgrounds there, including children from a terrorist organization, but the child. So this book originally began in my mind. It was in 1990. We had moved over there in 1990, and that summer, if you remember, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And I go to pick up my children, including this younger son who is very politically savvy, even at 11 years old. And we said, Iraq invaded Kuwait this summer, and he says, well, what happens to Talal and Alex, who are his two very good friends? Well, Talal was the son of the Kuwaiti ambassador, and Alex was from Iraq. From then on, when Talal visited, we had two big bodyguards outside our house, and Alex never came back to the American school. So I began thinking about these children of, people over there starting the EU, just a whole group of kids that were all, playing with each other, knowing each other. They didn't have the barriers between them because they just were kids. And so I began writing through that prism with Lizzie. And some of the early editors or agents said, well, maybe this should be a young adult novel. And I said, it's not a young adult novel. But the critique that it should be a young adult novel alerted me that I need to make sure people knew it was an adult novel, beginning with Lizzie at a young age, but she grows up, and it's over a span of about 15 years, so she grows up. But learning that, you learn, you're constantly learning as a writer. So that was the journey of Burning Distance, and it does go from her at 10 and ends about 15 years later. Okay. Now this novel, The Far Side of the Desert, didn't take quite as long in terms of the span, but its dateline is 2007. And when I was writing it, I would have to say, in finishing it, nobody, at least in my reading and seeing, was paying attention to what was happening in the Sahara Desert. Now people began to see a lot of mischief was going on. But again, a novel that might have been prescient had it been first published, and now it's a bit historical. Okay, this is, the dateline is July 2007. A Moorish king and queen bob momentarily above Samantha Waters' scrambled eggs as if waiting to be fed. Outside the second floor windows of the Hostel de Res Catolicas, 12-foot puppets of kings and queens and devils and saints peered into the dining room, then lurched away toward the square. Samantha leaned over the balustrade and filmed the festivities on the plaza below. Let's go, Monty, she urged her sister, who was hunched over a wooden table with a plate of pancakes. We can get coffee on the plaza. Outside, the smell of coffee and fresh almond cakes rose from the push carts as pilgrims hurried past, shaking tambourines, beating drums, and filling the morning air with sound. Somewhere, bagpipes played. The sun was already baking the cobblestones in the square, where tables and chairs had been set up. It's too crowded, Monty complained, as they merged with a stream of dancers and musicians. This is a security nightmare. It's a festival. Samantha spotted an empty table and tossed her black straw hat over the heads of the other spectators to claim it. They'd arrived late last night, and from London, she from London and Monty from the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. At breakfast, they'd read the guidebook, which explained how a monk in the 9th century had discovered the body of the apostle in a vault in the king and queen's home village. The village had been celebrating its destiny ever since. Remind me why we came here. Monty blinked into the sun. We're not Catholic. Are you doing a story? We used to live in Spain. I thought it'd be fun to come back. We lived in Madrid, not Galicia, 30 years ago, Monty said. You're doing a story. You're always doing a story. A correspondent for the International News Network, INN, Samantha conceded the point. But not today. I'm hoping Cal will get here too. Their older brother was flying in from Washington en route to a magazine assignment in Turkey. It's beautiful here and filled with history, Samantha added. Everywhere in Europe is filled with history. Cairo is filled with even more history. Monty pulled off her khaki jacket, rolled up her shirt sleeves, and unbuttoned the waistband of her slacks, which was pinching her. I wanted to see you before you disappeared on your new assignment, Samantha said. She watched her sister, who seemed more irritable than usual. Monty's pixie-like features were young, but she'd put on weight, and her pale brown hair flared into gray arrows at her temples. Monty was 37, married, with 2 children. Samantha, still single, was almost 40, but looked like the younger sister. Samantha waved for the waiter threading among the tables. I also wanted to cheer up Cal before his divorce, though none of us knows how to take a vacation. Monty pointed to the massive Baroque and Romanesque cathedral across the square, its twin towers rising over 200 feet, like giant dripping sandcastles framing the facade. How do they know it's the real body of the apostle in there, she asked. Samantha read from the guidebook. A hermit saw lights and heard music in the woods and found the body. Ever since, Santiago de Compostela has been the destination of pilgrims in their journeys of faith. Faith in what? Monty asked. Even you don't have faith in 2,000-year-old bones. No, but I have faith in festivals. Samantha smiled an easy smile. Monty frowned. People want to believe in something larger than themselves, Monty. Well, anyway, I won't go on. One of them gets kidnapped. And it's really a story of a family. The family is a diplomatic family. They've been in the Foreign Service. They've lived many places. And trying to come together, but nobody contacts them. So they literally do not know where the sister is. And it's you know, it involves terrorism and trafficking and financial, you know, a lot of financial manipulation and money laundering and everything. And I found in thinking about it, though I didn't originally think about it, but in thinking about my own work, what has interested me, and often in the way I'm writing, is I sort of have 3 circles of narrative. And one is the outside story, which I suppose is more the journalist in me, looking at what the circumstances are, you know, whether it's people trafficking, money laundering, whatever it is, a war. And that's sort of the outer story that these characters are living in. And then the middle circle is the circle of the family and their community that they're living in. And then the very inner circle, and the most important, is of the main characters. And if done well, the theme of the characters, the family, and the outer circle all relate. So they weave together. And, you know, and that's what's interesting to me. And the journalist in me, I don't know, many of you have been journalists, I think. Have you? I mean, you have been, yeah. Well, the journalist in you, you know, looks at the world, and you're outside the world, and you're, at least the old journalist, you try to report objectively and get your facts and make sure you know everything. And the novelist in you is imagining things, and it's really in conflict. I mean, you know, I say, be quiet, get off my shoulder. Because the journalist in me says, but wait, is that true? You know, and I said, wait, I don't know. So what I've found has worked for me is I'll keep a long list of facts to check, but I don't make myself go check every fact. And it's amazing to me how many times I've written something that has come really just in thought, and as I check the fact, I've gotten it right. Or sometimes it's not right, but I know it's not right, and it's okay, because, you know, it's not definitive to the story. If you say a date, you want to make sure the date's right. And you want to make sure that the facts that matter are right, because that is part of keeping the reader inside your universe and believing it. And if they know there's something, well, that didn't happen, then she doesn't know what she's talking about. So you have to sort of get that understanding of which facts matter and which don't. But that dialogue between the journalist and the creative writer it can be annoying, but it also, I think it's exacting. I'm very glad to have started there, because I think as a journalist, three things I learned. One, I learned to be writing in a disciplined way every day. The nice thing is I got published every other day and I got paid. That was very nice. And so when all the insecurities of not getting published every day and paid as a fiction writer, I always know, well, I do know how to write. And then the third thing, I just learned to listen to people. So I'm very comfortable with dialogue. I could just, I have to watch out that I don't just write entirely in dialogue, which suits this town. So I've never written for the for the movies, but I think it would be fun to do sometimes, and because dialogue's I just see stories through dialogue. So that's fun. And I don't know if there are any questions. I mean, I can just ramble on forever. I mean, talk about families, talk about the writing process, teaching human rights around the world.
But what sustains you spiritually through knowing that, yes, this would be published because your voice needed to be heard and readers needed to read what you had to say? In other words, what do you know now that you didn't know then?
Yeah. Good, a very good question. And I can't say that I ever would say I knew it had to be public. There's a point at which I said, and I often would tell my students, it's very liberating if you'll write as though nobody will read it, because then you'll really write what you want to write. And sometimes it's true, nobody will ever read it. So I don't know. My one small concern is my children love me and they've known me so long they wouldn't matter. But I have all these drafts and research and notebooks, and I thought, when I'm not here, they're going to go, what was Mom doing? I mean, she just has papers and papers and papers. So it's nice to see them get out there, because when I went straight from college to the writing program at Johns Hopkins, the writing seminars program, and one of the first pieces of advice the novelist said is, don't throw anything away, because you might, this is before computers or anything, nobody's waiting for my archive. So at some point I've just got to but it takes time to clear it. Yeah. But what sustained me is, I can't say when, but there was a point at which that monkey that's on people's backs got off my back. That sense of either professional competition with somebody else, professional comparisons with somebody else, any jealousy, it just left me, because I think I partly reasoned through it. I said, you're so fortunate to have something you love to do. You need to be faithful to it, to this talent, whatever it is, to write well. Just make sure you're doing that every day, and make sure your days are full, and then just being grateful every day. I think that's very important. Going to bed grateful every day and waking up grateful every day. And it's not a Pollyanna view. It's just, as one does that, life tends to, show you a path to take you didn't think. But I don't think there was any assurance that these books would get out there. But I never stopped looking, and I love my agent now. I love all the agents I've had. But, an agent is a business person. So after a while, if it's not published, they'll say, I think maybe you should find someone else. So I've had a number of agents. And that's not fun. And we all know, and you get that rejection, even if it's a glowing rejection, it's just like you punched in the stomach, and part of you just doesn't want to do it. So for a while, you just don't send it out anymore. I mean, there's times I had books just sitting there waiting, not being sent out for quite a long time. I just didn't send them out anymore. And I got a new agent, and she liked it. So, I heard once Michael Cunningham, who wrote The Hours, and Michael said, all writers have one thing in common: failure. We've all had failure. And I love also a quote from John Steinbeck in his early writing days, and he was getting rejection, Pascal Covici, and he was getting these rejection letters, and he said, well, at least one more person has read my work. Well, at least one more person has read my work. So I think if we're fortunate enough to have an art that you love, you're fortunate enough to have that within you, and just cherish it. and nurture it by doing it. And, there are no guarantees, but I think what makes us go forward in life isn't necessarily the book on the shelf, though it sure is nice to have the book on the shelf. But yes.
When you've sat down to write, have you ever been surprised that the theme is tweaked a little differently than what you thought?
Always. I'm always surprised. Yeah. I sit, and it goes to the question that, everybody has different answers. Where does the book begin? And sometimes it begins in a character that you're pursuing. Sometimes it begins in a question you want to answer. And sometimes it begins with a sentence. I mean, it just, it just gets you on the road, and then you keep going down the road, and as you're developing the character, and part of it is learning, for me, I think for most writers, learning who these characters are. And you really have to get to know the characters before you can make them alive, in your books. And so sometimes you write a lot that you need to be smart enough to know to get rid of after you know the character, because the reader doesn't need to know it, but you have to know the character. And the theme emerges, and sometimes the characters give it to you. In The Far Side of the Desert, there's a major, well, first of all, in the first chapter, 3 of the major themes are there, though you won't know them until you go through it. But one of them, I didn't know when I started this book how that was what was going to happen. And when I saw it along the way, I went, of course, oh my gosh, there it is. I built it the whole way along, and I just hadn't seen it coming. So often with students, when they get, or even any writer, I was recently talking to a fairly experienced writer and says, I'm just stuck. I know this and I know this, and I don't know what's in the middle. And I said, well, go and read what you've already written, because very likely the answer, you've already written the answer, you just are not seeing it. Yeah, you're not seeing your own answer. Your character knows. So go back to your own work and your own characters, because they often know. There's a book that hasn't been published yet. That has a great blurb from Carolyn C. if it ever gets published, called California Story. But in it, and I often try to, when I'm writing, I try to end with, I don't quite know what's happening yet, so sort of on a little bit of a cliffhanger. And in one scene, there was somebody who was going to be walking through the door, and I thought it was one of 2 characters, and I go to write the next day, and it's another character, and I go, oh my God, I did, of course, it's, and I realized all these seeds have been planted, and I just hadn't recognized them myself. And I think in reading, I love to read books that surprise me, and then in that surprise, I say, of course. And sometimes the writer is not the first to know, I like to tell the story. Sometimes I was once on vacation with my husband, and I love to write in restaurants and outside, and people once asked my ideal writing environment, and I said in the middle of a newsroom where I can write fiction and everybody leaves me alone. I love the buzz around. I mean, it concentrates my mind, and I don't fall asleep and somebody else fills my coffee cup. Anyway, so I said, look, I'll just stay an extra day and just write all day. And so I went down to dinner, and I was working on a novel, and there was another woman they had seated next to me, and when they go to serve coffee, she says, I see you're alone too. And I go, I'm not alone. I mean, I wasn't alone at all. I had all these characters in my head. I had no sense at all of being alone, because, the characters were all there. And then I realized we're sort of strange beings, writers, We're walking around with people in our heads that nobody even knows are there.
Given the manuscripts in your drawer and ideas you have, what other genres are you considering pursuing?
I actually have an essay that was published in the Hopkins Review called Manuscript in the Drawer. and let me segue to that and then answer your question. And in it riffs, or it elaborates a wonderful essay by a critic called Anatole Broyard, who was a New York Times critic decades ago, who talked about how important it was for writers to be writing and not to worry if it wasn't getting published, because what we are doing every day is ordering the universe and adding that thought to the thought of the universe, and how important that was. And I always loved that, and I used to share it with students, and I couldn't find it when I went to write this, but I think it was very important. It was the value of the manuscript in the drawer. I'm open for anything. As I said, I've never written I've never written, screenplays or play. I wrote a play in my master's thesis, but I haven't done that. But that could be fun to do. But I find that I keep going to the novels. I'll write a short story thinking I'm writing short stories, and then that story will link to another story and to another story. And it's like I'm a marathoner. I mean, that's just my form. I can do the sprints, but I really love the long form. But, you know, if something came up, I would love to, you know, give it a try.
Okay, one more question. What is your method? What is your process? Are you a pantser or a plotter?
It's a good question. I take elaborate, in the very beginning, I'm taking elaborate notes on my own thoughts. You know, and I'm writing down characters' names and structures, and I have just notebook after notebook. But I've never been able to sort of plot a whole novel out. I just don't. I can't play three-dimensional chess either. You know, I don't. I just learned to trust the story. But so the most important part for me is getting to know who these characters are and what their relationship is. One book, and a number of you may have read it, the one book on writing that I found probably the most, that spoke to me the most, was by Lejos Egri, called The Art of Dramatic Writing. And I just love the concept, for instance, of the unity of opposites. You know, you have your what keeps them on the stage together? You know, why don't they just leave? So what is that unity? So I recommend that book, but each book for me writes itself differently. You know, my first novel, Dark Path to the River, there it was just taking me along. It was racing so fast I could hardly keep up with what it was doing, and I felt like I was shaping it. Others, I feel like I have this block of stone and I'm cutting away trying to find what the story is within it. In others, I'm building the story as I go. But I cannot just plot a book. I don't know how to. Yeah. I know here and I know there and I know there, and as I write, I begin to understand, and the drafts take me on, which is probably why I'm not quite as fast as others. But
Building on what next, and I know your California book is there waiting in the door. Have you ever considered writing a collection of short stories that are linked by a uniting theme? So it'd be a combination of sprints with a marathon.
yeah, I love that, and I often think that's what I'm going to do, because it makes such sense to do that, because you can do the story and then the next story. But what I find, and when I've started to do that, it turns into a novel. So, but I do have, I have a short story called "The Arc of My Mother's Life," which is published in one anthology, and another one called. It's just called For the Love of the State of Texas, I think it is, published in another anthology. And those stories were part, but never made it into California Story. But they were sort of backstories. As I was writing them, I was thinking I was writing a collection of stories. So it works that way. But I think it's a nice way. I'll mention this, as many of you know this already, but you go and you write, and that's only part of the journey. Because the book comes out and you got to get it into the marketplace. I mean, unless you're really, I think there are writers that don't have to do that anymore. But most writers, you've got to figure out how to get it to the readers, and they don't teach you that. So, that's part of it. So my publisher said, back when let me go back a bit. When I finished my work with Penn, 2007, and I was with a fellow writer, and I went to this group of women in Washington, D.C., and a number of them were younger, and they were talking about their websites and their URLs and Twitter and Facebook. I didn't know any of these things. I said, oh my gosh, I've got to join the century I'm in. So I better get a website. So I got a website, and this wonderful person who set it up, who's still around, I'm so happy, I'm still happy with it, said, you've got to blog. And I went, blog? I don't even know what a blog is. I don't want to blog. But he encouraged me, so I said, okay, I'll do it once a month. So for 15 or more years, I've written at least once a month a blog, and I really love it because I can go back and see what I was thinking each month. So my publisher said, your blogs are great, but nobody knows they're there unless they go to your website. You need to do a newsletter. And then somebody said, no, not a newsletter. You need to do a Substack. So I said, I don't even know what that is. But I learned, so I now, once a month, do a Substack, and what that really is it is anything you want it to be, but it's like your own little magazine. So in my Substack, I have the blog, My Substack's called On the Yellow Brick Road. It's free. Mine are free. A lot of them you have to pay for. And if you sign up, I'll give you a book. You can sign up, I'll subscribe you. You don't have to do anything. You'll just come to you once a month. Is the blog, the news of the books, any book news I have on my own books. And then I profile a writer at risk somewhere in the world because I'm still involved in that. So the one that just came out May 1 profiles this sad case of a writer in China, and the month before was a writer in Turkey, because I still have that information. And then I usually give 1 or 2 books to check out. So this month I did the blog's title is Bridges Through Literature, which sort of addresses some of what we're facing today and the importance of that. And I had gone and heard a relatively new novelist who's Palestinian, and she has a collection of short stories that are a novel. Just thought brought up, and it's called The Sea at My Back or something like that. And it's just about the Palestinian experience, multi-generational in Baltimore. And it's not very political. There's some have been affected by things, but and then I paired that with Amos Oz's short story collection novel, Between Friends, where he does the same. He has stories that are put together as a novel, and it's about a 1950s kibbutz. Again, with the tensions of multi-generational families. And implicit in that, of course, is that here you have 2 different experiences, but what literature does is so important, is literature takes us to the human experience, into the heart, into people, and to the shared experience we have, whether we're 1950s kibbutz or 2020, inner city Baltimore, and they're just shared themes. And I don't spend time laying those out. I mean, if you read the 2, you'll see them. And that sort of has been fun for me. And sometimes I've paired books of not very well-known writers with very well-known writers because the themes connect, or there's something that connects it. And that's just fun to do. And then I usually give a couple of words you'll never use but might like to know, funny words. But and you can do anything, you can do anything you want. It's your own little magazine once a month, and it's my Substack. Others are, for instance, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, a man named Richard Haas, has a Substack once a week called Home and Away. And you get Richard's take on what's happening in the world that week. And he's a very smart man. I happen to, I know Richard, and I always love to read what he has to think and say about what the world is happening. And then there's one woman named Heather Cox Richardson, who has like 1 million followers, and she writes every day and gives us the history of it. I mean, she gives American history, and that's, I can't read it every day, but I subscribe. And a number of people, you pay for it, but you can also get it for free, so you don't have to pay. So it's a new modality, and Substack is just a platform on which people can publish. And that's why publishing these days is so open to people, and yet so difficult too, because it's very disaggregated.
So I've been intrigued by all you've said about writing, but I found I was also intrigued by this journey that you took from New York to LA to London to Texas. And I was going to raise my hand and ask you, well, what took you to Texas?
Born and bred in Dallas, 17 years of my life. Yeah.
I see that you went to school in the Midwest, that you had a little detour there at the a small, I think,
A small college in Southern Illinois.
called Principia.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you, because we were talking so much about undergraduate education, what effect your undergraduate education had for you at that college? And to keep on the personal, how did you meet your husband?
Okay. Well, okay, those are all good questions. I went to my mother had gone to Principia, and so she encouraged me to apply early. And so my husband always used to kid me. I had a not going to Stanford complex because I never applied to Stanford, sort of where I thought I wanted to go, because I got in early admissions, and once you got in early admissions, you went there. It was a small college in the Midwest. And the nice thing about a small college is that you can be a big fish in that college. So I was the newspaper editor. I did a lot there, and that built a kind of confidence. But it's a smaller universe. But what I've found since is a lot of people I went to college with that I've sort of reconnected with. We also a lot of us went off. So I went off to Johns Hopkins and then to Brown, and another person went off to Columbia, another to Northwestern, and they went off to really good graduate school. So we got a good, solid education in the Midwest. It was very rural. It was in a place called Elsa, Illinois. There was nothing around. I didn't have a car. So, but I was a rebel rouser even there, because it was the late 60s, and it was a conservative college. So one of my early editorials, well, one of the real big ones was, if equality, then action. You say you want to have an equal campus, where you've got to go out and recruit. You can't just sit here. But a little more frivolous ones was that women should be allowed to wear slacks in the library. And sophomores should be allowed to single date without special permission off campus. So I was in a conservative college in a very frothy time in the 60s. And then also with Principia, I went abroad the spring semester of my junior year. I was editor of the newspaper sophomore, junior year. In the spring semester, I went abroad, and that just opened the world to me. And I lived in London that summer. I went to Greece and France and Italy, and I knew the world was big, and there were Vietnam protests all around, and I was writing about those abroad, and the administration was getting very upset that I was going to Vietnam protests, in Italy and London, and so it was interesting. So I went small, and then I went big. When I went to Hopkins, I was really worried that everybody was going to be smarter than me, because I'd been in this small college. So I spent all summer just reading. And I got there, and I was assigned the first seminar paper at Johns Hopkins, and it was on the topic of whether William Styron had succeeded in the Confessions of Nat Turner with his narrative voice. If anybody remembers, it was very controversial. And I analyzed it, and I did it, and I got an A+, and I said, okay, I'm okay. And I concluded he could do it. The writers could write. If they could do it well, we shouldn't be restricted on what we can write about in our imaginations. And how did I meet my husband? My husband was a graduate student at the Fletcher School studying international affairs, and we met in church. And that was fairly foundational for us. And we met in Cambridge. And then what's interesting, our two sons both went, my older son went to Harvard, and my younger son went to Tufts. So they went right where we met, and they got so tired of us saying, oh, we remember we were over there, we lived here, And my oldest son is, he went to Harvard undergrad and MIT for his PhD, so he's still there. I mean, he went out to Berkeley to teach and UPenn to teach, but now he's back in Cambridge, so, yeah.
Given all that you've told us about what you've done over the decades, and you bringing up the 60s moments of the Vietnam War protests.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the protests that are taking place on college campuses today?
Yeah. I'm just sorry we haven't learned more, how to handle them. Because, there just seem to me there's so many points at which, I've sat on a couple of university boards, and some handle them better than others. Clearly, students have a right to voice and to protest, and I think there's a tradition of nonviolent. My husband's thesis was on strategic nonviolent conflict, and he had a foundation he started on called the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I mean, civilian voices here and other are really important in a free society. So I think that's important, but that does not include, breaking the law, anti-Semitic comments, and, there's a corridor in which that works. And, I think there are places where that you do cross over, and you have to say you can't take away the rights of others because of what your protest is. And maybe a university administration just doesn't spot it fast enough or know how really to set up forums let's have these discussions. Let's set up a forum and have these discussions as a university, as students and faculty. Let's, bring together in this, and there are no simple answers, but in this blog I just did, I referenced when I was the international secretary for Penn. Penn International has 4 standing committees, and one of them is the Peace Committee. Well, I understood the Writers in Prison Committee, getting writers out of prison, the Translation and Linguistic Rights Committee for translating, protecting linguistic rights, the Women Writers Committee, I was part of that founding, but what does a Peace Committee do? You pass resolutions so it always was a little nebulous to me, and I had this thought that we never executed. Well, maybe since we're Penn, we should be writers reading each other's work. So let's take Palestinian pen and have them recommend one of their best pieces of literature, not politics or anything, and have Israeli pen read it and talk about it, and Israeli pen recommend their best literature and talk about it. And then really optimistic, or even fantasy is the two would come together and talk, which didn't happen. Well, none of that ever happened. But clearly in a university, it should be ideas that should be debated. And there's a role for protest, but it's within the corridors of respecting the rights of others and not defaming anybody or spreading hate. And how you respond if that does happen, of course, is the question of when police come in and others. But it's amazing. It's like we don't learn from history, but we often haven't learned from history.
You're terrific. I wrote a lot of novels a long time ago. And you mentioned how much fun this was to write, and that's fun, and this is fun. And I had a lot of fun writing those novels because I was a journalist all day long, doing, getting it on Now, getting it on First, getting it on Right, and then I could go home at night and write mysteries and make it up. Mm-hmm. That's fun.
Yeah.
Now, a long time I haven't written, and now I'm back to writing since the pandemic. It's not as much fun anymore. So how do you have fun doing it?
That's a good question. I can't tell you how to have fun. But maybe just this is a very sort of trivial answer, but maybe just change the location where you're writing. I get up, and if I go out and find a restaurant or a place, I know where I can write. I mean, I love this place. I can write here. Where are the plugs? Okay, there's the plug. And I go to a place that will serve me breakfast and lunch, and I'm not taking up nobody's seat. I don't want to crowd the restaurant. And that works for me because I'm with people around me. I'm not all isolated, and I can do that. So maybe just changing the location of where you're doing your writing. That's very trivial, I realize, but maybe just make a change that jogs you or thinks about something. Or another I find really helpful is to go to your bookshelf and pick up something you really admire, a writer, and start reading them. Okay, because you read a really good writer, and there's something real comforting. As I tell all my students, your mentors are on your shelf. So just pick up a writer and read them for a while, or begin your day by reading a good writer. Yeah. A good one. Yeah. Good.
A lot of grit, a lot of grace.